Okay, I think, oh yeah, that's on. I know you guys don't need the mic, but live stream does. So, this session we're going to talk about building an evangelistic culture. Every church has a culture. Every church has things they're known for. It can vary in a lot of ways. You can be known for great singing. You can be known for great preaching. You can be known for we help babies. You can be known for your children, your youth ministry. You can make a list that's exhaustive of how many things churches can be known for. Sometimes the culture is different. Sometimes you're known as the unfriendly church. Sometimes not for a good reason. Sometimes because, well, you're an unfriendly church, yeah. We all know the horror stories, where they come up and very sweetly say to the visitor, "You're in my pew." Okay, and wonder why they don't come back. So there are, there are different cultures. Some churches are very much about the culture of let's take care of our own. Some churches are let's protect, we'll circle up and defend ourselves against all the bad things in the world. Some churches are very much about preserving the doctrine. Some are very much about preserving the kids. Well, I'm going to talk today about developing a culture in your churches where you want to reach people for Jesus. And that's a different mindset. That doesn't mean you're not interested in doctrine, doesn't mean you're not interested in your kids, doesn't mean it's not interested in your singing. It doesn't mean, but it means there are just things that become who you are, the DNA of your church. And so we're going to talk about that some. And I want to start, you may know this story too, because it's my second favorite story to tell, but Jimmy and Janie Moreno. They actually go to church with us now over at Hillcrest. And Jimmy just recently had open heart surgery, and as sometimes happens, his mind has not quite recovered from everything. But Jimmy and Janie, this is their story. We had a Christian at Southern Hills then named Ken. Ken would eat at the Dairy Queen in Abilene, right by Abilene High, often. Janie was the manager. They got to be friends. Janie asked Ken one day if he had a personal relationship with Jesus. Ken said, "Well, I do." And she said, "Well, can you teach me how to have a personal relationship with Jesus?" Talked to her. Janie became a Christian. She came to church all the time, but Jimmy would not. Jimmy was born Catholic, grew up Catholic, was going to stay Catholic till he died, even though he only thought about his religion or his faith or Jesus twice a year. You guess what they were? Yeah, Christmas and Easter. Yeah, he was a holiday Christian. We have a lot of people that was his kind of, at Easter and Christmas, I'm very much in, I'll even show up at Mass twice a year. That was Jimmy's, other than that, he didn't care. They had a son, Michael, who was bipolar. Had some medication to help him, got addicted to some of it, and so he would cycle up and down and up and down. He would live with him for a while, stay on his medication, not overdose with it, and do pretty well. Then he'd get off his medication, leave the house, get out on the streets, and they would hope he would come back. They bought a new house, had a room for Michael there when he would come, and when he was on his drugs badly, a lot of issues. When he was off of them, a lot of mental issues. So it was always a battle. They came home one night, walked in, and when you walked in their house, there was a table right back in kind of outside the foyer, and they came in and had some papers on it. They went and looked at them, and it was a note from Michael, and it was a long 3 or 4 page note, very rambling. I had parts of the Sermon on the Mount, and then after that, it'd be I know there's got to be something better. I can see the light. I just can't get to it. I've got to find the light. Then more of the Sermon on the Mount. And then he'd have a paragraph that would say things like, I've tried, but I just can't find it here. I know there's got to be a way to get to God. I just can't get there from here. And then more Sermon on the Mount. So after a few pages in, they realized this was some kind of potentially suicide note. Ran back in his room and found Michael dead. They went back and forth between intentional overdose or accidental overdose, but he died of an overdose. They didn't know what to do, so they called Ken, Janie's friend that had told her about Jesus. Ken will tell you now he didn't know anything to do, but, well, pray for her. He went over and started praying for him. After they visited a little bit, now here's how you start deciding what kind of culture your church is going to be. Jimmy said to Ken, does your church have priesty kind of guys that would come pray all the evil out of our house? And so Ken called the elders, and we had a meeting and went over and said to Jimmy, you need to hear the true doctrine about evil and possession and demons, because that was what was important. No, we didn't. That'd be horrible. Ken said, you know what I do think we have? We call them elders, but I know a priesty elder. And so he called us, and that's how Marcia and I met him. So what do you do as an elder when one of your members calls and says, we're looking for a priesty elder, and here's what happened? That determines what kind of church you want to be. And Ken did kind of say, I kind of think we're all priests, but, we have elders. So, and he said, I want a priesty elder. And you know what? I was a priesty elder. I mean, we're all priests, aren't we? And I was an elder, so I was a priesty elder. But in Jimmy's mind, we were dipped. So we went over, and you know what we did? Jimmy, Janie, Ken, Marcia, and I went through every room in that house. A little awkward in the bathroom because it was really crowded. Went in every room in that house and prayed for God's peace, for the Holy Spirit to be in that house, for evil to be kept away from that house, that whatever happened with Michael, that he found peace toward the end, all those kind of things. And weren't you a little uncomfortable with some of that? I don't know. I was an elder. I've probably been an elder. 50 of the best years of my life were the 15 years I was an elder. So, yeah, but I don't ever remember getting you guys ever get calls like that? I don't ever remember getting all my elder years, I don't ever remember getting a call saying, come pray all the evil out. We prayed about evil, so we got through, we're sitting in the living room, and Jimmy, because Jimmy didn't know anything about Jesus, goes, hey, you want a beer? No, thanks, I'm good, but you want to talk? And he said, can I ask you a question? Yeah, sure. What do you want to ask? And he said, where's Michael? And so I did what every good elder does. I said, well, I need to know first, was he ever baptized? Then I need to know why it was. You know what I said? I said, I don't know. I can tell you this about Michael. I know he was on a journey. I know who he was looking. I know God knows his heart. And so, but I can't because I'm not God. God determines who gets in heaven and who doesn't. So you think Michael's in heaven? Okay, let me try this one more time. I don't decide that. I know Michael was on a journey. And I know he was searching for God. And I know things weren't always right. So I hope in God's great mercy. Now, Jimmy and Janie believe God's mercy took him home. But you know what Jimmy said next? He said, my priest said he's in hell. And I said, Jimmy, let me tell you about your priest. He doesn't decide that either. I don't decide it. You don't decide it. You're a priest somewhere doesn't decide it. God decides who lives with him forever. I said, but I can tell you this, Jimmy. If God did take Michael to heaven, I can tell you how you can be with him. So would you like to sit around and tell Jesus stories? You know what Jimmy said? He looked right at me and said, not with you. Well, that's kind of, okay. He said, no. He said, I'm sure you're a nice guy, but he said, Ken's who I know. Ken's who has helped us. I'll talk to Ken. Well, that was a great lesson about a lot of things. So he did, and we eventually baptized Jimmy and Janie, and they eventually came over to Hillcrest where we are, and so did Ken, by the way, and they're still there. Every time Jimmy is in his right mind, they show up at church. I thought about that a lot, because there were a lot of ways you could have handled that. We need to have an elders meeting first. We need to correct all the doctrine. You know, I think doctrine matters. But we got to be careful. We referred to this a little bit in last class, the Matthew 28 passage. I told you it's not just a mission passage, just for us to go out in our world and make disciples. I think that applies to Brown Street, Waxahachie, Hillcrest, and Abilene, wherever we are, wherever all of us are. That's talking to us. Go out in your world. I did say it's not a baptism passage. We think that's a great baptism proof text. That text is not about baptism. It is about making disciples. Well, don't you have to baptize somebody? Of course. But if you think that making a disciple is about convincing them to be baptized, man, sometimes we get the cart before the horse. Teach Jesus and they will be baptized. Teach baptism and hope they catch Jesus, and you're going to get a lot of wet people. So know that. But I also tell you this. I've heard this verse used to prove we all ought to believe the same thing. Because it's real, if you know Matthew 28, it's real clear. Teaching them to reserve. And I've heard people use that to say, so when you get a new Christian, you teach them everything they need to know about worship, how the church is organized, and we'll all be in agreement. Okay, give me 2 minutes with any two of you, and I can start a doctrinal fight in here. I can. I'll find something that two of you won't agree on. Now, I do need to tell you, there's a lot of controversy in our fellowship about what's right about things. I've got the answers. I mean, really. After class, just come ask me anything. In fact, I'm so convinced I'm right. I told my wife, we're going to start a church in Abilene, and we're going to call it the church that gets it right. Because, a lot of churches don't, so we're going to be and it went great till about 5 minutes into our discussion. I mentioned something. She said, I don't agree with that. And it blew up the whole plan right there. It fell apart. So, I want to be real careful here, but sometimes we confuse evangelism with doctrinal correctness. And they are not the same. There's going to be a lot of people in heaven that I think are a little different on their doctrine. A lot of things that are pretty clear to me. But there's a lot of things that as we study and apply, we sometimes see differently. And to think that making a disciple is to get everybody to agree on everything, okay, those you guys are elders. I know you've never sat in an elder's room and had any kind of disagreement. This is about making disciples as we go into our world to talk about Jesus. In fact, what it says, you have to teach. Okay, you know what the two things you better teach everybody? What do you think they are? What's the greatest thing you can teach somebody? What's the greatest command? The greatest, not one of the 800. What's the greatest command? Love the Lord your God with all you have. And you know why you need to teach that? If you do that, boy, if God says it, they'll do it. Now, the flip side of that is if God doesn't say it, they won't be compelled to do it. But they will. And you know what the second one is? And you know what? Every new Christian, I always go into it assuming if I can just teach them those two things, if I can just remember those two things, I think I'll do about everything God wants me to do. If I'll just remember love Him and love people. That's Now, somebody says, well, if it comes down to it, which do you choose? No, Jesus was real clear. The greatest one is what? Love God and then love people. And please hear this, because I believe this. There'll never be a conflict between those two commands. Never. When somebody says, well, if you really love people, you can't do this. I'm like, no, God, no, that's us. God is never going to tell you to do something that's going to hurt people. Never. And if you love people, you'll always do what God says ultimately. So, if you're going to develop a culture, you got to decide what's going to be the emphasis at your church. Well, but if you teach right doctrine, that is emphasizing Jesus. Sometimes. You ever been in a church and realized you'd been several weeks and nobody said a word about Jesus except for the communion, and you've got that down to a quick 5-minute deal so you can get through it, so there's plenty of time to preach about doctrine. It's stressing you, don't worry about it. We have a phone going off, and so everybody online, my first worry is that I'm having some kind of stroke, but I think that, but everybody, did anybody else hear that? Just you, we're the only two that heard that, so I want you to know, if that wasn't your phone, we're in real trouble. But y'all heard it? Please tell me y'all, okay, I feel better. So, let me tell you, the kin that went to Jimmy and Janie, okay, and I told y'all when we started in the last session, I want to tell you again, everybody doesn't have to agree with me, But here we go. Ken's a recovering alcoholic. He will tell you, this is kind of Ken's story in a nutshell. Was baptized as a young person, 13 or 14, fell away, got married to a faithful Christian. She stayed faithful for years. Ken stayed away from Jesus for a long time. Then finally came back, wanted to get lost, but in a big church, just sit on we talked about sit on the back row, get out, but God kept working on him, and he became a really passionate evangelist. So he asked to meet with the elders one night. I said, sure, come on in. He comes in and says, well, I guess most of y'all know I'm an alcoholic. Now, about half of us knew. We had about, maybe almost 20 elders then. About half knew, about half did not know. But to their credit, they were like, okay. And he said, I have a lot of alcoholic friends. And he said, I don't think they'll come to church because conversations some of us are having. He said, and I think they're right. I don't think we would know how to welcome a real alcoholic. We'd recognize the ones that disguise it. We would know, so it wouldn't, but I don't know if we had a real alcoholic come in, how they would feel at our church. Ow. So he said, here's my answer. Now, I don't 100% agree with this, but I'm going to tell you what he said. He said, I want to go do church in a bar. Okay, in your church, what are you going to do when one of your members says that? Some of our guys later said, well, I was going to say something, but I just thought, you're never going to, no bar is going to let you do church, so what does it matter? Some of us said, okay, that's fantastic. Let's go do a church plant in a bar. He left, and we talked about it, and some of them thought, I don't know, what are they going to think about church in a bar? So, well, I hope Jesus. But if they're not getting Jesus, it's the wrong church anyhow. So, what do you think? And the overwhelming consensus was no bar will ever let you have a worship service in their bar. So Ken asked to meet with us next week, and then says, guess what? What? He said, hey, I met a lady I know at Tim's bar and told us where it was. And he said, I was telling her what I wanted to do. She said, I think our owner will let you do that. Let me ask him. She went and asked him. He said, sure. When do you want to do it? He said, we open at noon on Sunday. You have to be through by noon. But if you want to come do church at 11, have at it. And so they started church. Now, I'm going to tell you, it got hijacked by some. Everybody thought it was a great idea. Some people are more in love with the idea of doing church in a bar than doing church in a bar. Because you know who hangs out at bars? Struggling Christians or lost people that aren't Christians. So alcoholics hang out in bars. And everybody says, yeah, that's who we got to reach. Okay, it's easier said than done, but you know what? They baptize dozens of people every year from that little church plant. They don't do church like I would do it, but I sure appreciate them. And you know who the most effective evangelist is? It is the football coach at Abilene Wiley High School. And you know why he's so effective? He drives the bus in the summer to pick up people from different places and take them to bar church. And he'll say, hey, how are things going? And they'll say, oh, man, I hadn't seen my kid, or man, my parole, I got denied, or I still got my ankle, blah, 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 whatever it is. And he says, yeah, hey, I get it. Life's tough. Well, what would you know about it? And he says, because my life was a mess till I got married and met my wife and learned about Jesus. Was your life better now? And he says, oh, yeah. Yeah. He said, I have a family, I have life, I've kicked some of my addictions. Said, it's great. What'd you do? And he said, well, I decided I believe that Jesus died for my sins and was raised from the dead. I want to do that too, so I was baptized. You know what they say? Can I do that? Well, no, we have to explain a whole lot more. He just says, well, sure, we have a horse trough right over here outside the bar, and it's got water in it. And so he baptizes 6 or 7 people every year. Do all those people stay faithful? No, not all of them. Of course not. But, I always thought the whole point of that, I think and I'm going to tell you in a minute some better ways to do that. But I always thought, what if the eldership had said to him, you can't do church in a bar. Churches have to be, you have to have a building, and it has to be. They said, you know what? If God's calling you to do that, sick him. Go get him. So, Ken's a great sinner who is forgiven and wants to reach a lot of people and does. So at Hillcrest, most of you know I work part-time for Herald Truth, worked for them full-time for a long time, still work part-time and for them, but I work part-time for Hillcrest in Abilene as their kind of local evangelist. I told you in the first session, my job literally is to talk about Jesus. That's my job at Hillcrest, talk about Jesus. Hillcrest had a long history of foreign missions and a long history of Hillcrest takes care of Hillcrest. I mean, that was kind of the reputation. I don't think everybody there believed that, but Hillcrest's reputation for a long time was, if you're in, you're in. If you're out, you're out. So Hillcrest is very much centered on themselves and going everywhere else to preach the gospel. And so the elders, they're 14 now, and about 10 of the elders now were in this first discussion. They said, is this who we want to be? What if we decided we wanted to do in Abilene what we do all over the world? What if we decided we wanted to reach people? So they started praying about it. We now use the illustration. They started taking brush and they made a brush pile. Started piling up brush is what they were doing. And then they hired a guy named Nathan Burrow. Really good preacher. Baptized by John Orr, by the way, who's on, I think, isn't he on the program here? Yeah. I have to find John, hug his neck, and say, hey, Nathan says hi. Because Nathan grew up where John was preaching then. Nathan has a real heart for reaching people, and Nathan wants to reach people on the fringe. And they hired Nathan, and he told him, he said, my dream's that Hillcrest will not look like Hillcrest looks now. Now they will say, boy, we had a brush pile, and then we just took gas and started pouring it all over when we hired Nathan. So they're praying about reaching people on the fringe. Nathan really wants to do it. And so I'd been working full-time for Herald Truth and kind of moved to part-time, and a little church outside Abilene was trying to convince me to come preach for them regularly. And my wife one day said, I don't know why I keep thinking this. She said, I think you ought to call one of the elders at Hillcrest and just ask them if they want a local evangelist. I was like, well, why would they do that? She said, well, when we're not preaching out, that's where we go a lot of times. They know you, and I think they might want to do this. You ought to just ask them. I'm like, you don't just call an elder and say, y'all want to hire a local evangelist? She said, why? I'm like, come on, honey, you don't know how church works. I mean, you'd think. She says, I don't know, I don't know if there's a holy, you just need to call. So I said, you know how it is when your wife keeps telling you to do something? At some point, you're like, okay, this is going nowhere fast. I might as well call, and I'll go in and tell her, hey, I called, they're not interested. So I called a guy that was an elder there and said, hey, we're fixing to take a job out here outside of town, but you guys don't want a local evangelist, do you? And he said, I don't know, don't take the other job. I was like, psh. So I go tell my wife. He told me not to take it, but he called me the next day and said, can you meet with us Saturday morning? Okay. So I'll go in and sit down. I said, okay, what do you want to know? And they said, well, we know this, we don't have to, we know you. I mean, it's Abilene, Texas. Everybody knows everybody. We know you. We have known you for a long time. We know what you do. They said, we've been praying for a long time that something would happen at Hillcrest. And we know you like to talk about Jesus, so we want to hire you. And that's when I did the famous, so what's my job? Talk about Jesus. What's my title? You want one? Well, no. Okay, talk about Jesus. Well, what's my job description? You're not hearing us. We want to support you to talk about Jesus. And so now I tell people, if I'm in Abilene, I'm working for Hillcrest. I leave the city limits, I'm working for Herald of Truth. It's kind of how it works now. And you know what? When we tell people how this happened, the elders started praying. It was like stacking up brush. And we hired Nathan, who had a heart for people on the edges, so we started pouring gas on the brush pile, and all it needed was a match. And Nathan will tell people, he said, boy, you were the match, and we were primed for it. And the elders made one great decision. Now, this is really important about leadership and churches and your culture. And I don't even think this was going on when we did our stuff. I don't think all this was happening yet when we had our classes over with the School of Evangelism. Yeah. The elders told all our adult classes, quit making Nathan teach all the time. And he started a class for seekers, about 20 people. He just says, hey, if you want to ask questions about Jesus or about church, this is your class. And so I kind of helped Nathan in that, and we have 15 or 20 people. And then they went to our big adult class on Wednesday night and said, Steve's not going to teach for y'all anymore. And they're like, why? You know how churches do? Every Bible class went to Nathan, and then I did the big Wednesday night class a lot. And they said, we're going to let him start a class called the Jesus Journey, and we're going to invite people who don't know Jesus. And so we now have about 40 to 50 people in that class, about half Hillcrest people passionately committed to teaching people, and about half people we just round up from wherever. It's really been interesting because we get a lot of, the first group that came, one of our guys was teaching Bible class in a halfway house and said, can I invite them all to the Jesus Journey class? Sure. And they all showed up. And I'll tell you some of those stories, but when you decide to really pray about something, when the leadership says, God, we want this church to be different. We want to reach people. We don't want to look like us. We don't want to be inbred forever. It's like God said, okay, if you mean that, here they come. And then you get a guy like Nathan who says, listen, I'm all about ministry and our church, but he said, I want to reach people, and I don't want them to look like us. Because Hillcrest was, to be honest, kind of an old, white, upper middle class church. And boy, now we're different. We're different. So it can happen, and I know that because I'm living it. So you have to set your priorities. In 2 Corinthians 5, verses 14 through 20, if you don't know that passage, go back and read it. But the big thing is it talks about us being ministers of reconciliation. Now, I hear sometimes elders say, yes, that means in our church we've got to keep everybody that gets mad together because we're ministers. It's not talking about Christians. That passage is talking about that we have been entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation, bringing people that are separated from God back to God through Jesus. That's the mission of the church. We do a lot of things because Jesus did. Our mission is to reach people. We see people like Jesus sees people. So when you leave this building or any other building, when you walk out of the doors of your house or your church, everybody you see is someone that Jesus died for. Every one of them. And every one of them is someone that God loves. And every one of them is someone that God wants to live with him forever. The race doesn't matter. The economic status doesn't matter. The nationality doesn't matter. So we don't have to talk. I'm just going to tell you one of the great exercises is just look at your church and say, so what do we look like? Who are we? We've been entrusted with that message, the message of not counting our sins against us. And I'm just going to tell you, I don't know about you personally, but one thing that drives me to talk to people is I know how much God's forgiven me. I know. I have no right to ever walk into heaven. I have no right on the judgment day to say, hey, God, I did pretty good. Here I am. I will every day be thankful for what God's forgiven me with. So, it is also helpful for you just to ask these kind of questions to your church. What are you known for? Well, everybody in town knows that we don't have instruments. Well, good. When they get to heaven and God says, why should I let you in? They can say, because I understand why you didn't have instruments. I got that. Don't get in because you're staying on instrumental music, for or against or whatever. Some churches are known for that. Some churches are known for serving the community. That's great. That is a great reputation. What's wrong with being a church that just helps everybody? What's missing if all you do is help people? Yeah, they don't get. Sometimes what we are, I don't know all your churches. I'm just, y'all can agree with me or not. Some churches are Rotary clubs on steroids. We'll feed more, do more, help more, but if they don't get Jesus, some churches, are known for what they're against. Well, if you want to know what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with all the other churches, what's wrong with, just come to this church and you can hear everything wrong with. I know there are times you have to say this is wrong. I like churches that talk a whole lot about what they're for. I like churches that are a whole lot about hope, not guilt. I want people to come in and hear a message that says, your life can be different, here and forever. because of Jesus. And if you're going to talk about everything that's wrong in the world, you sure better follow it with what the answer is to what's right. So you can agree with that, you cannot agree with that. I'm just sharing this to think those are things worth asking about. Or some churches are known because they're a forgiveness church. And that church, that's where all those guys that were alcoholics and all those guys that blew up their marriage and all those people that, were like that, and I think it's a great reputation. I was part of a church for a while that the reputation around town was they're the church where all the screwed up people go. I thought that was a great reputation. I like that at Hillcrest. I mean, I'll just, because this really isn't one of the stories, but I'm going to tell you. A couple of Wednesday nights ago in our Jesus Journey class, this guy walks in and nobody knows him. I mean, so finally, we're doing class. He came in a little late, and so after class, I said, "Hey, I'm Steve." And 2 or 3 of us were meeting him and said, "So, how'd you know about us? How'd you get here?" And he said, "Oh, I just got released from prison this morning." "Really? Well, how'd you find Hillcrest?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. One of my cellmates is a guy named Joseph." "Oh, we know Joseph. Yeah, he's back in temporary custody because he violated parole. Doing well, but slipped. And when you're on parole and you slip, consequences are a lot greater than for some of us that slip and nobody knows. They get tested and all." So he said, "But boy," he said, "he's hoping to get out and come back to his church home." And he said, "You need to go over to Hillcrest because they help everybody. So here I am. I don't have anywhere to stay tonight, and I'm hungry." I said, "All right, where's the deacon over benevolence? We can solve it." No, I said, "Great, let's go get a Subway sandwich, or it'll give me an excuse to skip the elders meeting." Okay, if that ever gets back to Hillcrest, by the way, I'm going to deny that, but I may have thought it. And so another guy and I, because we always do stuff in teams, another guy and I took him over Subway, took him at Salvation Army. Oh, they teach stuff that's not right sometimes. Yeah, but they let people stay for free and help them find jobs. Took him over to the Salvation Army. We were about 5 minutes after closing, but they know us, so they let him in. And you're saying, "Yeah, and then you studied with him and baptized him." No, hadn't seen him since. But you know what's pretty cool about that whole thing? I like being known. When you get out of jail, somebody says, "Hey, go over to Hillcrest. They help people." That's the reputation we want. So, let me tell you how some of that works in real life. That's Victor, Noel, and me. Obviously, the day he got born again. Victor's sister, Gwen, is a single mom. Life's been hard. I know she's told me, and then he told me a lot about their growing up, and it was tough. Had a mom who was mean and linked it to Jesus. Not really, but in her mind, I guess, she would do Jesus as she would be abusive. And so Gwen eventually ran away and stayed with an aunt who was a Christian. She became a Christian. Life's been hard for his sister Gwen, but she's real involved in our Jesus Journey class at Hillcrest. Invites a lot of people, helps a lot of people, talks to a lot of people. She is one of ours that when people say, "Well, my life is a mess, my son committed suicide," Gwen says, I know where you are. Happened to me. I can talk to you about that and how Jesus. So she's great. Victor was living in Big Spring, a little farther west than Abilene. He has had a hard life, alcohol, and all the stuff that goes with it. So he starts finding this growth in his stomach. His stomach keeps growing. He finally goes to the doctor, and they said, "Hey, you've got something going on here. You need to find a specialist somewhere besides Big Spring." And he said, "I got a sister in Abilene." And the guy says, "We know doctors in Abilene. We'll connect you." So she comes and gets him, brings him home. She calls me and says, "My brother Victor is in the hospital. They have diagnosed him with cancer. It is bad. Would you go see him?" Sure. Now, you'll hear that's kind of a theme we have. Somebody's in the hospital, will you go see him? So I go up, I meet him, we talk a little bit, and I said, "Hey, while you're up here, while you're waiting for them to kind of decide what's going on," he said, "Well, I think they're going to do surgery really quick." And I said, "Okay, you want to just tell Jesus stories?" "Yeah, Gwen said you'd say that." "No, I don't think so because I'm doing this surgery real quick." He calls me because I left my cell phone. He calls me next morning and says, "Well, I've got some kind of something going on. They're going to have to put off the surgery for at least a week." I said, "You want me to come up and just visit?" "Yeah, would you?" So a couple of visits. He said, "Okay, tell me your Jesus." So we started talking Jesus stories, telling Jesus stories. Gwen would read the Bible to him all day, and I'd come up a couple times telling him Jesus stories. So after we told a few of them, told a few things, stories out of Acts, he says, I need to be born again. He said, can we do that? And I said, well, let's find out. Go down to the chaplain's office. They're great. They said, yeah, we'll set up the rehab pool. Now, it takes a couple of weeks to get in. And the doctor's got to release him. And we couldn't get anybody to release him. And we're working on it. And he said, well, what happens if I die before I get baptized? Okay, a lot of this has to do with your culture. I said, God knows what you're doing. I said, you're standing on the edge of the baptistry. You just can't get in. And I said, we'll just keep praying about it, and you keep praying about it. We kept doing that. And then he calls and says, they're kicking me out of the hospital. I said, why? And he said, I got to build my strength back up, and they'll bring me back in a week and do the surgery. And I said, okay, so what do you need? And he said, well, Gwen's taking me home, and the doctor thinks I probably shouldn't be in water or do anything strenuous, but I told him I needed to be reborn. And that's the day, 2 days out of, in fact, what really happened, they called him back in. We set up the he wanted to do it in a couple of days because he wanted his dad to come down. Okay. And they called him, did emergency surgery, and closed him right back up. By the way, his cancer is bad. And the doctor said, don't get it wet, don't do anything for 3 more days. And that's the day after because he wouldn't wait to be born again. Now, we did it different. We had to kind of squat him down and pick him up. But, that was okay. Victor had written a poem about grace and forgiveness, sin and new life. And we had it was one day about noon, and his dad did get there, had about 60 people from Hillcrest come up, and he read that poem. We read it several times. He's now doing radiation chemo, never misses a day. It's, what do you do with people that don't know Jesus? So, let's talk about visitors. I don't know how many of y'all ever read this verse. If all prophesy, and a believer or outsider enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. I tell people, you know what I want for the worship service at Hillcrest? When our non-believers get invited, I want them to be convicted. I want them to be called to account for their life. I want them to have their heart ripped open. I want them to see that God is among us and fall on their face and worship God. That's what I want. And you know what? Sometimes it happens. I don't want us to be like the story about the kid who came to church and came home and asked his mom. His mom said, how'd you like church? Not going back. How come? Said they kept promising me supper, kept talking about supper. They finally served it in just a little bitty cracker and a sip of juice, and then they tried to charge me for it. That's how some of our people see worship. I want people to come in and be in awe of the God we worship. I want them to say, wow, there is something different here. So, I want to tell you how it sometimes happens at church. The guy with his hand up is John Coss. I'll get emotional. I'll try not to. That's John Coss. The guy holding his arm up is Joseph, who is now back in, I call it temporary parole, time out in prison. If you violate your parole, you can spend 45 or 90 days, but if you get things straightened out, they'll let you back out. On you go. So that's Joseph. The guy in the very back is Gary Stone. Gary was teaching at a halfway house. Joseph actually was baptized right before we went to prison. He was baptized about 2 weeks before we went to jail. Gary was involved with it. Promised Gary when he got out he'd come to Abilene and find him. Got out, sent to El Paso, got permission to move to a halfway house in Abilene, moved up, and Joseph has a great story. But Joseph and Gary started talking to John about Jesus. John in prison had a stroke, and they wanted to do brain surgery, and John refused it because he said, I don't care. Just let me stay here and die. I don't care. And so he's paralyzed on his right side. He started coming to church, started talking about Jesus. Gary, Joseph, and I kept telling him Jesus stories. He wanted to be born again, and he wanted to do it in front of his church family. And so one day between church and Bible class, we baptized John. Now, here's what makes this, Anybody that was there that day will never forget it. And we had a lot of visitors, and this is what triggered them to talk about Jesus. The guy who was opening, we have baptistry doors, and our baptistry is way up high. So they're opening the doors. He thought the song was ending, and so it was time to baptize. So he starts opening the doors, and it was between verses, and they started, and it was, I don't even remember which, it was one of the contemporary songs that has an a cappella arrangement. And so it was one of those, the congregation was singing, and it was emotional, and it was great. And we looked over, and John's doing this, trying to hold his hand up in praise. And so Joseph reached over and held his hand up for him to praise Jesus. And then tears are running down John's eyes. Joseph's wiping the tears away and holding his hand up. We finished the song, and we asked John what he believes. And he says, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God who died for my sins. Baptized John. Everybody then sang more of the song, and it's great. Got in, and John said, I'm so sorry. I started crying. I said, why? I said, God forgave your sins. That I was crying, you were crying, Joseph's crying, Gary, we're all crying. He said, but you don't know how many sins God had to forgive. And I said, yeah, I do. I get it. Me too. The other thing that's neat about somebody said, why did all four of y'all go in there? Because Gary, who was teaching his Bible class, has a speech impediment. Gary could not even talk to his wife for years because he can't speak in front of people. He would write, how he ever got his wife to marry him is amazing. But he said, I can teach a Bible class. I can't speak in front of the congregation. Don't make me. I said, well, we'll get Joseph to baptize and take his confession. And Joseph said, hey, I'm just new to this stuff. I want everybody to be baptized. I don't know what I'm doing. Why don't we all go in there? It was like, sure, we'll all go in there. And so that's how four of us ended up in there. And Joseph actually is the one that baptized him into Christ. Everybody was at that worship service. All the Christians were crying and thinking, man, this is what God meant us to be. And we had visitors there. Since then, since that baptism, Joseph's now wife, then his girlfriend, she was baptized, her son, two other guys from their halfway house. From what they saw, and what triggered it was watching John be baptized at the end of our worship service. I don't know if it was the singing. I don't know if it was watching John. I don't know if it was the tears. I don't know if it was Joseph. But that is the sweetest. We about every 6 months show that picture at church just to remind us all of who we are and what God's calling us to be. So, books back there if you want to look at them. If you think this guy's crazy, but I kind of like that, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've got 12 subscribers. No, I've got more than that. But I've got about 3 times a week I do a little 5-minute thing that tells somebody's story or talks about cattle and Jesus or different things. So thank y'all. We'll have one more session here in a few minutes. I think. Am I right? That was a bell I heard, or is my head exploding again? Okay. I always worry. Oh. And then, this is the lost sheep one. Perfect. Thank you. Because we start again at 10:35? Oh yeah, it'd be about right. A 5-minute, 10-minute break. Thank you, Lord.